Well, it's a tale of two prime ministers. Over the weekend, Anthony Albanese flew to China while his predecessor, Scott Morrison, visited Israel. One breaking bread with a hostile aggressor, the other flying into a war zone in a show of solidarity with Israel and the Australian Jewish community. Israel was the trip our Prime Minister should have made. Instead, he's cosying up to dictator and President Xi Jinping. It's not that stabilising our relationship with China isn't important. It is, but only as long as it doesn't come at the cost of Australian values and our national security. For this visit to happen, for Albanese to get the red carpet treatment in Beijing, Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Patterson cites 5 examples where the Albanese government has made major concessions. The first is leaving in place a Chinese company's 99-year lease of the Port of Darwin. Albanese should have torn this lease up, as he indicated he was prepared to do when he was in opposition and campaigning for the top job back in 2022. Then he said he'd be willing to use foreign veto laws to cancel the lease. But then Albanese announced on October 20th, just a few weeks before his China trip, that Landbridge's lease would remain in place. Defence experts say there are serious implications of allowing a Chinese-owned company to control a critical deep water port, and the US has never been happy about this arrangement. Secondly, the World Trade Organization was likely to deliver a damning decision on China regarding its sanctions on barley and wine, that it had broken international trade law. But Australia saved Beijing from this humiliation. Albanese asked the WTO to pause the process, allowing China to quietly wind down the tariffs. Had Australia progressed with the WTO actions, China expert John Lee says it's unlikely that Anthony Albanese would be in China right now. Another instance, the Beijing-backed Confucius Institutes have been accused of foreign interference by the Intelligence Committee, as you know. But Penny Wong has continued these 11 institutes to continue to operate. She's only said that the new ones won't be allowed to open. James Patterson makes the point, and he's joining me on the show a bit later, if it's against Australia's national interests to open new institutes, then shouldn't the current ones be shut down as well? Yet another example. In opposition, the Foreign Minister Penny Wong called on the then Morrison government to consider targeted sanctions against officials or companies who were profiting from human rights abuses and the use of forced labour on Uyghurs in Xinjiang. She also demanded the government explain whether it sees these human rights abuses in China as genocide. But about 18 months into her term as Foreign Minister, we've seen no sanctions at all. And lastly, number 5, James Patterson says that the Albanese cabinet has stopped all public criticism of China's human rights record, also its aggression in the South China Sea. Just 2 weeks ago, China rammed a Filipino vessel in the South China Sea, and Australia didn't utter a word. It wasn't until Albanese was in Washington and Biden forced him into a joint statement to say something about it. The Washington's Hudson Institute senior fellow John Lee says that in exchange for a steady diplomatic and economic relationship, China wants Australia's silence, neutrality and passivity. He writes today in The Australian that there's a dangerous element of naive and fuzzy thinking surrounding the Prime Minister's trip to China and his government's approach to managing this difficult relationship. Well, there's a saying that Albanese likes to sprout when it comes to China, that we must cooperate where we can and disagree where we must. But the problem is, there's not much disagreeing going on, even when it's a matter that goes to the heart of our security and sovereignty. Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Justin Bassey, made this point in August when Albanese had failed to call out Beijing's bullying of the Philippines. He wrote that it is to the Albanese government's credit that bilateral relations with China have improved and tensions have reduced, but the formulation of cooperating where we can and disagreeing where we must is not sustainable if the policy means trying to reduce tensions by ignoring differences. He says this doesn't deter Beijing's destabilising actions, it emboldens them. He writes, if Australia does not strongly call out such a provocative and destabilising breach of international law, one has to wonder what constitutes an issue on which we must disagree with Beijing. Ultimately, this is all a case of Labor saying one thing in opposition when it comes to China and then doing the precise opposite once in power. And it's the same with the cost of living crisis. Albanese promised he'd be able to make life more affordable, so lower energy bills and the cost of housing. Instead, the cost of living is demonstrably higher than it was when he made those pledges. And on Israel, as we've been speaking about, Albanese promised to be a friend of the Jewish homeland. There was this front page of the Australian Jewish News when he was campaigning for the election, where Albanese, as you can see there, he promised. He says, no change to Palestine platform. But that's not true. He hardened Australia's position against Israel with several foreign policy moves long before the October 7 terror attacks. Instead, it's Scott Morrison, our former Prime Minister, who's travelled to Israel in a show of solidarity. He wrote today, I can only imagine how isolated and abandoned this must make our Jewish community feel as they see the protests against them in their own country, as well as listening to double-minded statements that pretend to offer support. When it comes to Israel, there always seems to be a but when offering support. That is just exactly right. The contrast couldn't have been greater between Albanese rubbing shoulders in China and Morrison standing there in Israel alongside Boris Johnson. All of Australia's Prime Ministers over the past 27 years, from John Howard to Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard to Tony Abbott to Malcolm Turnbull and of course Morrison, would have certainly, as Prime Minister, visited Israel to show support, just like every world leader around the world has done. But Albanese has refused to visit Israel, Australia's ally, while he sucks up to China, that's part of an emerging anti-Western alliance, a strategic partnership that's formed between China, Russia, North Korea and Iran. The Australian's foreign editor, Greg Sheridan, describes this strategic partnership as an axis of evil. We know China's engaging in a rapid build-up of nuclear arsenal. It's the single biggest aggressor when it comes to state-sanctioned cyber attacks, and its foreign influence operations are highly sophisticated. But this is where our Prime Minister is, while Israel, the Jewish homeland established in the wake of the Holocaust, fights for its very existence as Jews around the world face unparalleled anti-Semitism this side of World War II. Just on Thursday, Albanese turned a question about anti-Semitism into an answer on Islamophobia. And he followed the same approach taken by Kamala Harris and White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. Listen to how he speaks with a bit more passion about those experiencing Islamophobia, while his answer on anti-Semitism seems quite clinical.
We are concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism, which has been on the rise, and we provided money for security in Jewish schools and Jewish institutions, synagogues, but we've also provided money for the Islamic community and the Palestinian community. There are women very regularly who get abused, who get vilified because they're wearing a hijab in this country as well. And these forms of hatred are completely unacceptable.
This is serious gaslighting of the Jewish community, both in the States and in Australia. And we're experiencing a crisis of anti-Semitism here and around the world. Some people say, oh, this is just the Labor Party worrying about its base, about politics, about marginal seats in Western Sydney. But that's not good enough. It shows Labor has lost its moral compass, has lost the ability to do the right thing if it means costing them a few votes in Western Sydney. And you have to ask, who are they pandering to anyway? We're seeing unbridled anti-Semitism emerging from the communities where Labor is courting votes. First, we saw the Lakemba preacher, Sheikh Ibrahim Dadoun, celebrating the terror attacks of October 7 just 24 hours after they took place, and while many of the atrocities were still unfolding. Then today we learn that this Islamic leader, known as Brother Ismail, gave a sermon at Al Medina Dawah Centre in Sydney where he encouraged jihad.
If the Australian government like it or not, if the ASIO likes it or not, if they want to deport me from Australia or not, the jihad is the solution for the ummah. Muslims, so interested and so thrilled and looking forward to join the Mujahideen. Muslims, they starving for jihad.
And that video reported on by The Australian today and obtained initially and translated by Memory Television. But they can't wait. Listen to what he said. They can't wait to be among the Mujahideen. That's people who engage in jihad. And it's usually used to refer to Islamic guerrilla militant fighters that carry out terror attacks. And his comment that there's now a danger to the national security of Australia, well, this is threatening. It sounds like it's inciting violence. It's dangerous hate speech. Police, thankfully, are now investigating. But it's truly terrifying that we have these individuals living in Sydney, people who preach this and people who sit in this audience and lap up what he says. If he can be deported, like he says, well, he should be. Let's be clear, these views have no place in Australia, and Labor needs to unequivocally condemn these comments and call out the shocking anti-Semitism we're witnessing or experiencing. Israel's war on terror, Israel's war on Hamas, has exposed the Prime Minister and his true colours when it comes to Israel. Despite ASIO boss Mike Burgess and the FBI Director Christopher Wray both warning of the heightened threat after the October 7 terror attacks, Albanese has shown no leadership on this mendacious anti-Semitism that's now at crisis point.